very pleased to meet you. Just for everyone's notice, Dagan and I don't know each other. We've just met 10 minutes ago. So good to meet you, Dagan. So this is an opportunity, Dagan, to think about your river of experience, what brought you into humanitarian and some of the key milestones, key issues which kind of have changed your course on the way and made you think on the way. Where would you like to begin?
Hmm. I guess I would say that unlike most people, I grew up in the after leaving Somalia as a child, I grew up in the US, and unlike most university students, college, we call it college in the US, I was one of those people who always knew what I wanted to do. I knew that I wanted to go home, I wanted to come back to Africa. And I pretty much knew that I was going to go into the space of humanitarian development, whatever you call it, and just try to help my people. Um, and so I started my journey probably in the in the domestic space. I worked with Amnesty and other groups in the US, but in the international space, I started it off with the UN um, when I came to Kenya in 1999. And so that was my first real understanding of the international aid system and architecture and how it worked. And I will say that I was not very radical. I was extremely like conformist. I thought that my success will be determined by getting a UN job. I wanted to join the UN. I thought the UN was like the greatest thing since, sliced bread.
Yeah.
And so I joined the UN, being very optimistic. And of course, the salaries didn't hurt. It was great salaries.
Mm.
Um, and just the prestige and all the things that comes along with working for the UN. And so, yeah, so I would say that I was a very typical aid actor in that sense when I first came into the system.
And what changed that? Because I know from what I've heard, you're quite a radical. So what's influenced you to kind of make you question that system as it was?
I would say a couple things happened in my journey. The first was once you get into the system, how first of all, I guess my first wake up call was how hard it was to get a UN job as a Somali American with the same pedigree as the average white person in Nairobi. Actually, I was more educated than many people in Nairobi who had no degrees and who had very senior jobs. And so that was my first like experience with racism. And I didn't understand, I didn't expect it. I had come from the US, very domestic, like very racial society. And I knew racism very well. I could spot it. I knew how to call it out. Unlike the average African who comes into the system, or average Asian who comes into the system, I think they don't understand it the way that I probably do coming from the US. So I think the US environment really honed me in to understand power, to understand racism, and to call it out and have the confidence to say it. I think if I was educated completely 100% in Africa, I probably wouldn't be as radical and as hyper aware as I am.
Okay.
Because I see a lot of my colleagues from the continent who just are not able to see the same things that I see.
Mhm.
And sometimes I wonder if it's a burden to be able to see that stuff. I find it as actually a burden. I find that I envy their ability to just coast through life and just
Yeah.
like any kind of remark that's made at them that has a very strong racial overtones, they just don't even notice it, you know?
Mhm.
Um, and so anyway, so I think that was my first like wall that I experienced. And then once I got into the system, I realized how easy it is to get a job and just keep progressing. And then I noticed people were progressing not based on merit, but based on other things, other factors. Like I
Mhm.
saw my regional representative who was basically an alcoholic, not doing anything, and he would never get fired. And that made me like question, and he would send me off to meetings with ministers. And I would be like, I'm a 28-year-old kid. I have no business sitting in a meeting with a minister in Sudan or in Eritrea. But because I'm the UN, it's not a big deal. I should have access to these spaces in these rooms. And it was actually his job to be meeting with the ministers, which I later found out. I started even questioning that. Why is it a regional rep meeting with a minister? I still have serious issues with how much access international aid actors get to politicians. And I think that we give them far too much access than they deserve. That's me speaking as a person who wants to be a nationalist, who is about sovereignty of the continent and of the global South in general. Um, Anyways, so I I had access. My data, my information, my reputation was never questioned. I was basically given like a red carpet treatment wherever I went. And so that was my experience. And then I left the UN and I joined a local NGO that my mother founded called Adesso at that time, called Horner Leaf. And immediately, completely different kind of treatment, just 360 degrees, complete opposite.
Yeah.
I would try to go to meetings representing Adesso, and I wasn't allowed access because you're a Somali local NGO, and this is not a meeting for Somalis to be in the room. And you're
Mhm.
discussing Somalia, you're discussing my country, and there's no Somalis in the room. I mean, like, these are the kinds of things I constantly experienced. I saw how hard it was for my fellow local actors, leaders of local NGOs to express themselves in English, English not being their first language. I would have these private conversations with them where they are the some most articulate human beings. But because I understand Somali, I know how articulate they are. And then they come into a public space and you could see how they're struggling to make themselves understood, basic understanding, rather than just being at the level of being articulate. And how, like, I could see the lack of patience, how these white people would roll their eyes literally in a meeting because they don't have the patience to wait for somebody to express themselves in their own language. And they don't give them any translation facilities. And so these are like, yeah, so those are, that's, and then later, of course, we had a drought and we came up with some drought data. And our data was questioned, and I was publicly told in a meeting by a white man from UNICEF that we were lying and making up numbers. And he actually said to me in public, your numbers are false, you're lying, and you are making up numbers to get money into your clan community area.
Wow. Wow.
Um, I I was shocked how like blatant, I mean, how free he could feel to say that kind of stuff to me in a
Yeah.
public
Yeah.
meeting. Like there was no like shame in it. There was no hesitation. There was no nothing. And there was no accountability. Nobody held him accountable in the meeting and said, hey, that's not appropriate. You can't say that. Not at all. I'm sure all of them agreed with him privately, but maybe they didn't have the guts to say it like he did, which I appreciated. I liked the fact that he said what was on his mind and his heart. Um, anyway, so later, of course, all of our data was proven correctly. We were able to successfully get a UN interagency assessment happening in that area, and all of our numbers were proven accurate. If not, we were actually told that our numbers were a little too conservative, and then the
Mhm.
death of livestock in our report was slightly lower than what the assessment finding were. So, but did that automatically open doors? Did we start seeing all local NGOs in Somalia taken seriously, or Adesso taken seriously? Not really. That didn't really have much change in, okay, so they're not lying. They have credible figures. There was a real drought. All those livestock did die. Maybe we need to start now, like paying attention to local organization. Absolutely not.
Can
I
I
would
can
say
I
in
can I
some
draw
ways, not much has
down,
changed.
can I draw down a bit on that question of like when you were in the UN, you had this red carpet treatment, you got access all the time. Can I ask you about that? I mean, is that in your mind because they have money and they have power, or is it also because people give power to them? How much of it, what kind of is it underpins that access and kind of how it works in your experience?
I would say the governments give them too much power.
Yeah.
Um, in Somalia, it's the complete opposite. They take the power because there's a vacuum, right? There's no real strong government. I see in places like Rwanda or China or India where they don't have that power. And I respect those governments. And I'm always envious and wish that the Somali government was strong enough to push back and say, no, you're not running, taking the place of our governments and doing what they would like it so that there is no real power to hold them accountable. I actually don't think that the UN in Somalia wants a strong government. I actually think that they do everything to undermine a strong government. But ultimately, the responsibility lies on us as Somalis. I can't keep blaming the UN because the UN is, is made up of governments. So it is the Somali government that gives them the authority, and the Kenyan government, the government that gives them that authority, and Ugandan government, and so on.
Yeah, 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 that's interesting. Yeah, I was working in Sudan quite a few years ago, and with a very senior person in the Red Crescent, and they were saying the same. Like he said, I really don't want this job. I want to be in the government, and I want to be making changes within the government, not not in this parallel system which is undermining the government, and it was weakening the kind of the structural work in Sudan, and he could really kind of see that and clearly kind of see that's where the change needed to be in the governance system.
Well, I mean, the thing is, like, if you look at everything that the West does to undermine strong governments, whenever we have
Yeah.
strong leaders that assert sovereignty, 10 years ago, Kagame was a dictator. Ibrahim Traore right now is a dictator, according to the West. They malign these people. So anytime you get a leader that is really about sovereignty, that is really about the interest of his people, that is really about pushing the UN back, because the UN, in a way, has become an offshoot of the West and the interest of the West and these imperial actors. And so anytime you get a government that is very strong and um, very much asserting its sense of sovereignty, then you get these people maligned by Western media as dictators, oligarchs, whatever it may be.
So where does that leave?
Or that's the best case scenario, actually. Or in the worst case scenario, you get them assassinated,
Yeah,
which has
yeah.
happened in Africa quite a lot.
Yeah, and you see the same in Cuba, and the same in any nation state which drives its own agenda. Where does that leave humanitarianism in your mind, like the international system?
I mean, I think that first of all, humanitarianism has existed since the beginning of time.
Yeah,
And will continue to exist until the end of time. So the idea that humanitarianism is limited and relegated to this system that has been established by European countries as part of the Bretton Woods system is, for me, just hugely problematic. Human beings are always helping each other, no matter what color they are, no matter what part of the world they live in, they will continue to do that. If the UN stops working tomorrow and NGOs stop working tomorrow, people will still show solidarity in that way. So, so that's one. I mean, number two, I think that that level of solidarity that human beings show each other also, in my opinion, is far bigger in terms of quantity, the number of people and the amount of money that goes from human being to another human being, helping each other, neighbor to neighbor, community member to another community member. Like, look at the Sudan response right now. I'll just give you a very good example. Right now in Sudan, the entire humanitarian aid architecture, the formal system sitting in Port Sudan, they're not able to operate in majority of the country that are impacted. Who is operating there? Either local NGOs or volunteers called emergency response rooms, which bunch of volunteers who are not getting a salary, who don't have any kind of formal training. They're just like community members like you and me who are part of the affected community who start responding. And like, if you look at that and quantify that and put that along with diaspora remittances, along with what communities are doing to help each other, mutual aid happening every single day. I bet you, if you quantify that in terms of dollars, it will be far more than the supposed
Yeah.
money, dollars, billions of dollars that goes through the formal aid architecture. So I do think that there's a need to recognize that. It needs to formalize that and appreciate that we don't have that appreciation as we need to be a little more humble. We're a little too arrogant and think that we are the saviors of everybody, and we're
Yeah.
not.
Yeah, I mean, Salvation Aid is, I've been working in the Save the Children and the just for the last 2 or 3 years. I've been working in the public and private sector before then, and I've been absolutely shocked by the kind of salvation mindset I bumped into. I knew it's going to be there, and I thought it'd be a small part of the game, but I've been absolutely shocked by just it's kind of just endemic, just endemic, that mindset, and just how people are going to still think in that way. Even when they have the rhetoric to question it, they have all the nice words and nice rhetoric to question it, but beneath that surface is my experience is it's really kind of endemic across the aid system, deeply
Yeah.
embedded within us. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that I think this goes back to the issue of power and lack of just when things are so formalized and they are established from structures of inequity from the beginning, it automatically engenders this kind of behavior. This
Yeah.
system that we call the international humanitarian system was never established where countries were all equal, where people were already equal. It was established by colonizers and imperialists who were scared that these countries that they're going to lose their hegemony, that they're going to lose their power over these countries. And they had to figure out, how do we retain this power? Okay, let's come up with veto power. Let's come up with, we control UNICEF and WFP as Americans, and the head of OCHA, the humanitarian one, is a Brit. They made these agreements, and so once you have a system that is intrinsically unjust from the beginning and how it's designed, it will not engender anything other than lack of humility and arrogance and this idea of salvation and I'm going to save you.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's very hard to undo. It's like because people have. I mean, I just wrote a paper on this about people have a conscious awareness of it. People who are progressive or thoughtful, they have a conscious awareness of it, and yet there's like still an unconscious attachment to it. It's still like we're the good people. We can go and help the suffering other. And on one hand, that's a positive impulse to have empathy and want to help the suffering other, but to decouple it from kind of salvation aid is still a big piece of work, and to shift that towards a mutualist aid, if there's going to be aid at all from an international perspective. I mean, that shift towards mutualism, I think is the major stumbling block I've been working with in the sector for the last couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's maintaining that facade of power and superiority that comes with the foundational system that is inherently unjust. So it doesn't surprise me that it will take a long time. But I'm a very optimistic, actually. Though I'm very negative about the system, I'm actually quite optimistic that the system is breaking down as we are witnessing the system crumbling as we speak, with what's happening in Gaza, Syria, now Lebanon, all of these things, Sudan. So, just the difference, compare that to how Ukraine has been treated globally. Yeah, I really don't think this system is gonna be in place in the next for sure 10 years. I highly doubt it. I think the global south has said enough is enough. And this is why you have systems like BRICS. And I don't think BRICS will just be a system for financial architecture. an alternative financial architecture, which is very important and extremely needed to get our countries out of poverty so that they can take care of their own aid needs and don't need outsiders from the north. But we will also see them resolving issues politically. We will see them, creating alternatives to the UN and doing trade and all of that other things. So I'm actually quite optimistic, and I think that what's happening in the Middle East right now and Sudan is the vestiges of the end of the UN system, in my opinion, and not just the UN, just the whole Bretton Woods system.
Yeah, no, I agree. You can actually feel it crumbling, can't you? You can kind of feel it crumbling from within. It's undoing itself, really, unable to kind of adapt to the new paradigm it's facing, for sure. Sure. I mean, interestingly, we have Ukrainians participants here. It's interesting. There is also a letter from Ukrainian NGOs and CSOs really complaining about the international aid system as well. Although they got quite a lot of money put their way to actually get the money, and the way they were treated by the INGO system, they also felt very like it was a colonial kind of bureaucratic. It was box ticking. It was slow. It was not giving them what they needed. And there's many signatures to that letter kind of undermining it. So it happens even in parts of Europe and Eastern Europe, as well as in Africa and the global South. The centralization.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think there is elements of colonial that is connected to race and it's racialized, but I also think that it's not just the race, it's about power and money, and ultimately money. So I think that Ukraine is just a great example of, like, the system is not treating African civil society differently than Ukrainian civil society. It's not a racial issue. It's just that these international NGOs don't want to give up power and don't want to give up money. Um, and the system doesn't reward giving away power and money. The system
Wow.
rewards the opposite. So until we have a different incentive structure for CEOs and leadership of these INGOs and even the UN agencies, they're going to continue behaving in that way. We're, of course, trying to change that with the pledge, but it's really, really hard. When you are a CEO of an INGO and your metrics of success is about expansion, and going on opening offices in Gaza when you've never been there, or opening an office in Ukraine because now you just have all this money that you have to burn. And there's the word of burning, like, I mean, just that terminology, like that tells you the priorities, right? Like when you have a burn rate, how quickly can you get money out the door rather than what's the quality of how you use that money rather than how quickly that so obviously if you talk to them, they say this stems from the donor. The donor themselves is the one, like USAID or FCDO, who's pushing them to burn this money quickly, to spend money very quickly and all of that. And that's true, but I also say that, you don't have to play ball. You don't have to play those games. You can say, you know what, I'm not going to take your money if it's bad money anymore. That's a decision we made as a local NGO. Like at the height of Odessa, we were $21 million. We were getting FCDO, I mean, not FCDO, USAID, EU, Dutch, all types of bilateral funding. And we made a decision in 2018, 2019 to stop taking that money. And then in 2020, we made a decision to stop taking UN funding. And in 2022, we made a decision to stop taking INGO funding. So we got progressively smaller and less staff, less income. We went from 340 something staff to 15 staff in $21 million to a little less than $2 million. And we didn't even know how we were going to pay salaries. We didn't know how we were going to pay the rent. We didn't know we had to downsize our office, downsize everything. But if you are a $1 billion NGO, you have options. You know how, you're not scared of closing your shop tomorrow if you make some principled decisions. But the problem is that as a CEO, I'm not going to be rewarded for making those principled decisions. I actually probably be reprimanded by my board full of corporate types from McKinsey and others who think that
Yeah.
downsizing and reducing my income from $1 million to 300 million, $1 billion to 300 million is actually very negative for the bottom line of the organization and not a good CEO
Sure.
behavior. So yeah, so this is the problem. It's like the incentives that exist.
Yeah. Yeah. Part of the pledge is to change the way we tell stories. Is that right? The way stories are told. And I'm thinking we've got about 10 minutes left. What kind of story would you like to hear if we can imagine in the next sort of decade these massive changes are going to take place? What kind of story would be told around humanitarianism? Where do you see the direction of travel is and where the changes can take place?
I mean, what I would like to see is that we have articles in the New York Times and the Guardians talking about communities response rather than an NGO or UN response. That
Hmm.
we don't uplift the stories of these agencies that are really subcontracting and then subcontracting and then subcontracting to in the end is the communities that are doing the work or very small local actors. So I would like to see them being more prominently featured in these stories as the first responders and and you know giving the credit for where credit is due rather than it being given to actors that are still sitting somewhere in New York or London. And so that's the shift I would like to see around storytelling. I would like to see storytelling that really talks about people's agency and power rather than talks about them as just passive beneficiaries, passive people who need, I mean, the saviorism complex that you're talking about is perpetuated by the media, where we
Yeah.
constantly see Black and brown people, and especially women and children, in these horrific situations. So we need to stop that
Hmm.
and retrain the minds of the average person sitting in the West and as well as in the South, actually, that,
Yeah.
that a strong image is something you should be putting money into rather than an image of poverty and weakness and lack of agency.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the word in the civil rights in the USA, they talked a lot about consciousness raising, and it seems to me that that's what's needed is again is a kind of a new consciousness raising around this because yeah, the power is so pervasive. The way it works, like you say, through the media and through different channels, it's kind of like a soft power as well as a hard power of having money. It's kind of a soft power, and yeah, I think a new consciousness raising to kind of awareness is a big part of this work.
And the thing is, I think that the younger generations are just so in tune to this and
Yeah,
so um like they're already halfway there. They don't need a
hmm,
whole lot of changing. And the media platforms that is going to be the sources of news and information will not be the New York Times and the Guardian in the future. It will be the podcasts, it will be the social media, the X. Majority of people now get around the world get their news from X. Like if I want to know what's happening in Syria, I go to X.
yeah,
I don't open any newspaper anymore, or I don't go to NBC News, or I don't even open Al Jazeera. I go to X. So so like that's good. So we have to adapt. And I feel like the sector as a whole is very much still in the old ages. We're still in
yeah,
dinosaur age in terms of how we work, how we do things. I mean, how we communicate, how we engage with a younger audience, and all of that. I know that intellectually, but even as Adesso, we're failing, where we don't know how to do this very well, but we need to do better, and we need to figure that out. But what I'm saying is that the younger generation is really who we should be investing a huge amounts of time into thinking about these issues of imagery and storytelling in a different way, because they'll get it. And they're the ones who are going to have the resources to donate in the next 10 years, 15 years. They'll be your donors.
yeah, for sure, sure. Dagan, we're coming to the end. Is there any last message or thoughts you want to share before we close this session?
Well, I mean, as future, I mean, this is a leadership course. I think, you know, one of the things that I'm constantly talking to Global South people about, or leaders of local organizations, is that they need to really stop buying into, you know, to decolonize our own minds.
Yeah.
And what you called consciousness raising ourselves first before we can even talk about white folks or global North actors, because we have to also take responsibility for our own mess and our own institutions and what we create. And that means like taking the agency and the power into your hands and saying, you know, and not like when I came into Adesso in 2003, I wanted to be like an INGO. My metrics of success was exactly what a Save the Children or an IRC do. I wanted to become bigger, more offices, plant more flags, get more donors, blah, blah, blah. And it's only through really, really difficult, painful mistakes that I pivoted. And I would like you all not to spend 15 years of making those mistakes and just say, you know what, you know, be okay with saying no to bad money. Be okay with holding these very principled positions, and be okay with being small, and be okay with not thinking that growth is the answer to everything, because it's not. And so that's the message I'd like to leave these leaders.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much on behalf of us all. I know you've got to go, Dagan. Thank you for your time. It's been really lovely talking with you, and hope to meet you again on the journey. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Take care.
Bye now.